The following scenario is hypothetical and presented for educational and entertainment purposes. For 10 seconds, imagine the most dangerous silence in human history. Not the silence before a war, nor the silence after an extinction, but the silence of a world that never learned how to write. No carved mark, no clay tablet, no tally cut into bone that becomes a sentence. One failed invention, one broken threshold, and civilization does not stop, it mutates. The day it was supposed to begin is still remembered in this other world, although remembered is the wrong word. There are no records, no inscription on fired clay, no archive box sleeping beneath a desert floor. There is only a ritual story repeated by guild teachers, port accountants, and state witnesses who inherit the same spoken formula generation after generation. In the river cities of the southern floodplain, where grains swelled faster than memory and temples rose higher than trust, a certain workshop gathered to solve a practical problem. The city had become too large for the human nervous system. That was the real crisis long before anyone called it philosophy. Tens of thousands of people were exchanging barley, labor, copper, oil, wool, livestock, promises, taxes, prayers, punishments, and seasonal forecasts. Human speech could carry intention, but not scale. Human memory could hold stories, but not inventories. Biology had built a brain superb at navigating faces, alliances, and danger in bands of perhaps a few hundred. Yet here now stood a proto-bureaucratic organism of canals, granaries, storehouses, and rotating labor teams whose metabolic needs exceeded what memory alone could reliably coordinate. So the workshop attempted its leap. In our known reality, marks stop being decorative and begin acting as external memory. Here they almost do. The potters prepare tablets, the overseers prepare tokens, seals, and repeated symbols for sheep, jars, rations, fields. For one breathless season, it appears possible that thought may leave the skull and remain stable outside the body. That is the essential scientific miracle of writing. Not beauty, not literature, but memory becoming infrastructure. Once information survives the individual, institutions can become far more complex than any one person. Law can outlive judges, debt can outlive witnesses, orders can travel farther than voices, knowledge can accumulate instead of restarting. Except in this world, the experiment fails at precisely that transition. The symbols never stabilize, their meanings drift across districts. A mark for one ration in the western granary means a different measure in the eastern one. Seal impressions are copied too easily by apprentices seeking favor or thieves seeking grain. Tablet surfaces crack in storage. More fatally, the city's administrators cannot agree whether marks represent things, sounds, people, quantities, or sacred categories. The system remains cognitively expensive. To decode a stored tablet requires the same specialists who encoded it, and even they dispute the reading days later. Reliability, more than invention, is what turns a clever trick into a civilization-changing technology. Fire matters because it works every time. Mathematics matters because it yields the same answer regardless of mood. Writing in this world never crosses that threshold. It is not absent because no one imagined it. It is absent because standardization collapses before adoption. At first, nothing dramatic happens. That is how true civilizational failures often arrive, not as a meteor strike, but as a missed upgrade. The city continues. Boats still arrive with reeds and stone, bakers still knead flour into loaves. Priests still chant to the river. But the administrative load rises each season, and without durable notation, the whole urban system must compensate with living substitutes. If information cannot be cheaply stored in matter, it must be stored in bodies. A new caste appears, the Rememberers. Their training begins in early childhood when neural plasticity is highest. Science in this world develops strangely because literacy never externalizes symbolic reasoning, yet practical neurobiology becomes intimate and brutal. Masters learn that rhythm improves retention, that narrative structure preserves sequence, that emotional charge cements recall, that sleep deprivation corrupts detail, that paired recitation reduces divergence. that groups of 3 witnesses are more stable than 2. They do not call these things hippocampal consolidation, retrieval queue optimization, or distributed error correction, but that is what they are studying in effect. Entire schools emerge around the management of human memory as if memory were a domesticated animal, bred, disciplined, burdened, and periodically replaced when it decays. The cost is enormous. A written ledger can rest on a shelf. A human ledger must be fed, guarded, trained, socially elevated enough to deter bribery, yet terrorized enough to ensure obedience. Complex states in our world became powerful partly because writing reduced transaction costs. In this alternate one, every transaction above a certain scale remains expensive. To move grain from hinterland to city requires not only carts and guards, but chains of oral certifiers. At each checkpoint, witnesses recite quantity, origin, debt obligations, spoilage tolerance, and expected arrival window. A caravan does not merely travel with goods. It travels with its own nervous system, and nervous systems fail. A fever in midsummer kills 3 tax memorizers and erases an entire province's obligations. A boat capsizes and with it sinks not just copper ingots but the only living testimony of who paid for them. 2 brothers trained on the same legal precedents quarrel publicly before a court, each reciting a different inheritance formula with equal confidence. Modern cognitive science would recognize the mechanism immediately. Memory is reconstructive, not reproductive. Each act of recall is also an act of rewriting. In the absence of external fixed text, law becomes less like architecture and more like weather. This instability changes the shape of the city itself. Without dependable records, administrators prefer local visibility over distant abstraction. Districts become tighter, more surveilled, more redundant. Granaries are split rather than centralized because unrecordable abundance is a temptation and a liability. Markets develop in concentric zones so that reputation can travel where documentation cannot. Architecture thickens around choke points, gates, weighing courts, oath halls, witness towers. The city grows, but in a more dangerous shape. Not a clean network of impersonal institutions, but a clustered organism of bottlenecks where trust must be performed face-to-face under armed supervision. Even science bends under this pressure. Astronomy progresses because the sky repeats and can be sung. Metallurgy advances through apprenticeship because the furnace teaches by consequence. Medicine remains half empirical, half ritual, because case histories cannot accumulate with sufficient fidelity across generations. There are healers who know a plant lowers fever, but not why, and no one can compare 5 centuries of outcomes at scale because no casebook survives with enough precision. Knowledge persists vertically through lineages, not horizontally through libraries. Each master is a vault, each death is a fire. Children grow up fearing not ignorance, but misremembering. To forget a name is shameful. To misquote a contract is criminal. To hesitate in public recitation is to invite suspicion, because delay itself becomes evidence of deceit. Whole cultures of speech harden around this pressure. People speak in formulae because formulae compress risk. Poetry dominates not because society is especially artistic, but because meter is error control. Rhyme is a safety device. Repetition is an insurance premium. Ceremony is data integrity disguised as religion. And then slowly, something uglier emerges from the strain. When information is scarce, those who authenticate it become more powerful than those who produce goods. The rememberers were created as servants of complexity, but complexity begins reorganizing itself around them. Priests merge with auditors, judges merge with reciters, merchant houses marry into memory guilds. The poor, unable to afford certified witnesses, become legally blurry. If a debt dispute arises and no elite memory keeper sponsors your version, your truth may as well never have existed. In a society without writing, inequality is not only about wealth, it is about whose memory counts as reality. At first, the city's rulers think they can manage this with more training, more oaths, harsher punishments for error. But all they are really doing is increasing pressure inside a vessel already at its limit. One autumn, after a failed flood season and a disputed grain count at the Northern Reserve, 3 separate witness chains deliver 3 different totals to the palace before sundown. By nightfall, soldiers are at the market gates, merchants are hiding stock in sealed courtyards, and the rumor spreads that the temples have been lying about reserves for years. By dawn, everyone is waiting for one man to speak, the oldest rememberer in the city, whose voice has settled wars before. But this time, when he opens his mouth, he does not begin with the numbers. The old rememberer stands beneath the stone arch of the weighing court, where grain disputes, property oaths, and inheritance recitations have been settled for generations. The entire square waits for the numbers that will calm the city. Numbers are usually the safest language in this society. Precise, chantable, hard to argue with, when 3 trained witnesses agree. Soldiers line the perimeter. Merchants clutch sealed ledgers that are not really ledgers at all, just cords of tokens whose meaning only their apprentices can explain. The air smells like barley dust and sweat. But when the old man finally speaks, he does not recite the expected grain count. Instead, he says something that freezes the square. I cannot verify the memory. The phrase is terrifying, not because of what it means, but because it violates the unwritten physics of the system. The entire civilization is built on the assumption that verification is always possible somewhere. If one witness falters, another chain exists. If one guild contradicts another, a senior rememberer can resolve the difference through deeper recitation, older precedents, older contracts, older calibrations of measures. But this time, the chain breaks. The Northern Reserve count cannot be reconstructed. 3 witness groups have delivered incompatible sequences. Their rhythms do not align. Their measure units diverge. Even worse, 2 of the chains trace back to the same apprentice 3 weeks earlier, which implies that somewhere in the city's living memory network, an error replicated like a biological mutation. The scientific reality behind the crisis would be familiar to modern information theory. Any complex system that transmits data through unreliable channels must use redundancy and error correction. Written language eventually solved this by stabilizing symbols across time and geography. But here, redundancy exists only in human brains, and human brains are not neutral storage devices. They compress, reinterpret, emotionally tag, and sometimes unconsciously alter data. A single misaligned memory pattern can propagate through the system like a virus. That is exactly what has happened. Weeks earlier, during a storm delay along the canal routes, a caravan witness improvised a mnemonic adjustment to keep the grain totals aligned with a song rhythm. The change seemed harmless, the sequence still balanced when recited locally. But when it traveled across districts, the rhythm collided with a different counting tradition used in the northern granaries. The mismatch multiplied quietly across relay witnesses until, today, 3 entire memory chains arrived with different realities. In a literate world, someone could pull a tablet from storage and compare. In this one, the tablet never existed. The silence spreads through the square like a chemical reaction. Merchants glance at soldiers. Soldiers glance at the palace balconies. Everyone understands the implication. If the city cannot know how much grain it possesses, then no one knows whether winter will starve them. Panic begins not with shouting, but with whispering. Some merchants claim the temples have hidden reserves. Others insist the palace inflated past harvest reports to maintain calm during the last flood failure. Without writing, rumors move faster than verification because rumors require less memory discipline. They are shorter, simpler, emotionally charged. In cognitive terms, they have higher transmission efficiency. Within hours, the markets close. The palace attempts a containment strategy familiar to administrators across centuries. Centralization of trust. All witness guilds are summoned to the Hall of Oaths, a circular chamber designed specifically for large-scale recitation audits. Inside, more than 60 trained rememberers form a ring. Their task is brutal: reconstruct the Northern Reserve history month by month through layered oral recall. The method resembles modern distributed computing, except the processors are human minds. Each rememberer begins with a fragment: transport schedules, ration allocations, weather delays, temple offerings, tax seizures. The fragments are cross-recited, overlapped, harmonized. Errors are flagged when rhythms clash or sequence anchors fail to match seasonal events. Observers with bronze tally rods tap the floor when contradictions appear. Hour after hour, the hall vibrates with layered speech. From a scientific perspective, what they are attempting is reconstructive data recovery from a corrupted biological archive. Human memory is associative. One recollection can trigger others through shared sensory or emotional links. By synchronizing dozens of trained memories, they hope to rebuild a stable timeline. But the deeper they go, the worse it becomes. The error is not localized. It has spread across at least 5 administrative chains. The numbers for transport shipments do not match the numbers for warehouse rotations. Temple ration songs conflict with military supply chants. One district claims a flood destroyed 2 barges. Another insists those barges delivered successfully. By midnight, a terrifying possibility emerges. The city's grain reserves might be lower than anyone remembers. The first climax arrives quietly, like a slow mechanical failure rather than an explosion. The Palace Council, after listening for 14 hours, reaches the only conclusion possible in a civilization without durable records: certainty cannot be restored in time. So they choose the second best solution available in such systems: force stability through fear. At dawn, soldiers march to every granary and seal the gates. Grain movement across districts is suspended. All private reserves above a certain size are confiscated, pending verification. Public recitation of alternative grain totals becomes punishable as destabilizing speech. From the palace's perspective, the logic is mathematically sound. When information cannot be trusted, control the flow of material resources directly. Reduce the number of variables, simplify the system. But they have underestimated a fundamental property of human societies. Trust, once fractured, behaves like a structural crack. Pressure finds it and widens it. In the merchant quarter, caravans preparing for winter routes suddenly realize their contracts are unenforceable. In the outer farming districts, grain producers refuse to ship surplus without certified witnesses. Witnesses now trapped inside the palace audit. In the harbor, sailors quietly unload shipments at night and store them in private cellars rather than risk state seizure. Within a week, the city's supply network begins fragmenting into isolated trust islands. Anthropologists in our world would recognize the pattern instantly. Complex economies require low-cost verification systems. Writing eventually provided that by making contracts portable, durable, and independent of living memory. Without it, verification must occur face-to-face within limited social networks. And those networks are shrinking fast. Neighborhood markets reopen, but only for locals whose reputations are known. Trade across districts slows. Long-distance merchants begin bypassing the city entirely, selling goods to smaller towns where oral contracts can still be monitored personally. The metropolis that once seemed unstoppable starts behaving like a cluster of wary villages pressed too closely together. The rememberers notice the shift before anyone else. Their guild halls grow quieter each night. Fewer merchants hire certified reciters. Farmers prefer direct barter with nearby buyers rather than expensive witness chains. Even temple rituals begin simplifying, replacing long historical chants with shorter seasonal ones. For the first time in centuries, the profession that held the city's memory together is becoming economically fragile, and that fragility reveals something unsettling. The civilization had believed writing failed because the symbols never stabilized. But a younger group of apprentice rememberers studying the collapse patterns begins to suspect a deeper explanation. Perhaps writing did not fail. Perhaps the people rejected it. Because in a world where memory is power, Permanent records are dangerous. The apprentices start asking forbidden questions. What if the early symbols actually worked well enough, but the guilds destroyed them to protect their monopoly on reality? If that suspicion is true, then somewhere in the city's oldest layers there might still be fragments of the lost system. And if even one of those fragments survives, it could change everything. The apprentices begin their search in the only place where truth sometimes survives longer than power: waste. Great cities produce mountains of discarded matter: broken pottery, cracked tools, spoiled food, collapsed walls, forgotten ritual objects. Archaeology in our world often begins in garbage because garbage is rarely curated by elites. In this other civilization, the same principle quietly applies. The apprentices know that if early experiments with symbols ever existed, the guilds would have destroyed the official versions. But imperfect copies, failed attempts, or misunderstood fragments might still lie buried in the city's older refuse layers. Their investigation begins at night. The apprentice group is small, 6 memory trainees from different districts, each trained in a different specialization of recall: transport chants, tax recitations, temple inventories, maritime contracts, legal precedents, and agricultural cycles. Individually, they possess extraordinary mental discipline. Together, they form something rarer: a distributed analytical network. Because they were raised within the oral tradition, they understand its weaknesses more intimately than any palace scholar. Their suspicion rests on a scientific intuition. Technologies rarely disappear completely if they were once useful. Fire did not vanish after its first discovery. Neither did metalworking, agriculture, or mathematics. When something genuinely improves survival or efficiency, it tends to spread through cultural evolution like a beneficial mutation. The fact that writing left almost no trace in their civilization suggests not that it never worked, but that it may have been actively suppressed. If so, there must have been a reason. The apprentices descend into the city's oldest refuse terraces along the dry edge of the riverbank. These layered dumps contain centuries of discarded pottery fragments, shards from storage jars, bowls, oil containers, transport seals. Most pieces show only decorative grooves or kiln marks. But the apprentices are not looking for decoration. They are searching for repetition. In modern archaeology, pattern recognition often reveals the earliest forms of writing: repeated marks associated with quantities or commodities. A symbol that appears consistently next to grain jars or always paired with sheep bones begins to function as data rather than art. The apprentices use a similar method, except their database exists entirely in memory. For weeks, they collect fragments. At first, the shards reveal nothing beyond simple potter markings, but gradually a strange pattern emerges. On several broken storage tablets, small flattened clay pieces used long ago for sealing grain sacks, they notice groups of impressions arranged in consistent clusters. The shapes vary slightly, but the positions repeat: a wedge-like mark followed by 2 vertical cuts, then a circular indentation. One apprentice recognizes the sequence instantly. It matches the rhythm of an ancient grain measure chant still used in temple inventories. If the connection is real, it implies something profound. The marks may represent spoken counting units. In other words, the system might not have been about objects at all. It may have been phonetic. The discovery shakes the apprentices' understanding of their own civilization. The failure described in official guild histories claimed the early marks could not reliably represent commodities. But if the marks represented sounds instead of goods, the entire premise of the early experiment had been misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented. From a scientific standpoint, phonetic writing systems solve a critical scalability problem. Instead of inventing a separate symbol for every object, they encode the sounds of language itself. This drastically reduces the number of symbols required and allows nearly any concept to be recorded. It transforms writing from a narrow accounting tool into a universal information storage system. But that very power would have threatened the Rememberer guilds. If anyone could learn a few dozen symbols and record speech directly, the monopoly on memory would collapse overnight. The apprentices realize they may be staring at the fossil remains of a suppressed cognitive revolution. Their second discovery comes from an even stranger place, a collapsed kiln workshop buried beneath later construction. Inside the rubble, they uncover a stack of partially fired clay tablets fused together by heat. Most surfaces are warped and unreadable, but one tablet preserves a clear set of repeating symbols. 3 vertical marks, a wedge, a curved stroke, 3 vertical marks again. One apprentice begins whispering the ancient chant rhythm beneath his breath. Another aligns the marks with the syllable beats. Slowly, a pattern emerges. The symbols correspond not to objects, but to phonetic fragments of the spoken measure formula. Someone, centuries ago, had successfully mapped sound onto clay, and someone else had ensured the system never spread. The apprentices now understand the magnitude of what they are holding. If they decode even part of the system, they could create the first durable information storage technology the civilization has ever known. Contracts could exist independently of witnesses. Scientific observations could accumulate across generations. Laws could be compared precisely instead of reconstructed imperfectly from memory. It would fundamentally rewire the social structure. But revolutions do not occur in a vacuum. Outside the excavation sites, the city's trust crisis is worsening. With grain reserves uncertain and trade networks fragmenting, factions are forming. Merchant alliances are beginning to hire private witness chains rather than rely on palace-certified rememberers. Several outer districts have already started issuing local oath tokens to regulate markets within their own neighborhoods. In effect, the city is decentralizing. Complex urban systems without reliable information infrastructure often revert towards smaller trust networks. Economists in our world call this transaction cost collapse. When verification becomes too expensive, large-scale trade shrinks and local economies dominate. If the trend continues, the metropolis may fragment permanently. The apprentices face a terrible strategic dilemma. Revealing the proto-writing system could stabilize the civilization by solving the information problem, but it would also directly challenge the power structure that has governed the city for centuries. The Rememberer guilds would lose their exclusive role as living archives. The palace, which depends on those guilds for administration, might see the technology as destabilizing. And there is another danger. Information technologies amplify power as much as they distribute it. If writing emerges suddenly in a society already gripped by fear and scarcity, whoever controls the first archives could dominate law, trade, and knowledge at unprecedented scale. The apprentices argue for days inside the ruined kiln chamber. One faction insists the system must be released publicly, taught openly in markets, temples, and workshops before the guilds can suppress it again. Another argues the opposite. The symbols must remain secret until they can construct a complete standardized system strong enough to survive political attack. Their debate echoes a principle well known to modern scientists. Technological breakthroughs are not just discoveries, they are timing problems. Release too early and society rejects them. Release too late and someone else weaponizes them. The argument ends abruptly when they realize they are no longer alone in the excavation. At the edge of the chamber stands a man in the ceremonial cloak of the Senior Rememberer Council. He has been listening long enough to understand exactly what they found, and instead of ordering their arrest, he says something far more unsettling. You are not the first to rediscover it. The Senior Rememberer steps into the dim kiln chamber slowly, careful not to dislodge the fragile clay fragments scattered across the floor. The apprentices freeze. None of them had heard his approach. That alone says something about the man. Even at his age, his control of movement is precise enough to pass unnoticed through a room trained to detect subtle rhythmic disturbances. His name is Kareth, though the apprentices have never spoken it outside formal recitations. In the hierarchy of memory guilds, he is something close to a living archive, one of the last individuals whose training includes recitation chains stretching back nearly 2 centuries. If anyone in the city carries knowledge older than official history, it would be him. He studies the fused tablets in silence. For a long moment, the chamber holds the tension of 2 incompatible futures. On the floor lie the first fragile signs of a lost information technology. In the doorway stands the embodiment of the system that replaced it. When he finally speaks, his voice carries neither anger nor surprise. You are not the first to rediscover it. The sentence lands harder than any accusation. The apprentices exchange uneasy glances. One of them, Mira, the temple inventory specialist, finds her voice first. You knew. Kareth kneels beside the clay fragments and gently rotates one shard toward the lamplight. The wedge and vertical strokes cast thin shadows across the cracked surface. Yes, he says quietly, though not in the way you imagine. He traces the sequence with a finger, careful not to disturb the brittle clay. In every generation, he continues, someone begins asking the same question you asked. Why did the symbols fail? Why does a technology that could store memory vanish without leaving a system behind? His gaze moves across the apprentices, and eventually, someone digs. From a scientific perspective, his explanation unfolds like a case study in technological suppression, not through violence, but through structural pressure. The earliest symbol systems did work, briefly. Archaeological layers beneath the city confirm that several generations experimented with phonetic marking on clay. The prototypes were crude but functional. Grain tallies could be preserved. Contract phrases could be repeated exactly. For the first time in human history, speech could survive the death of the speaker. But stability requires more than invention. It requires adoption. The early writing system faced a problem that modern historians often underestimate: cultural resistance driven by existing power structures. In this civilization, the Rememberer guilds had already become deeply integrated into economic, religious, and legal systems. Their entire social function depended on the scarcity of reliable memory. Writing would have erased that scarcity. Yet Kareth insists the guilds were not the only force resisting it. The city itself rejected the technology in subtler ways. People believed, he says, that memory carried moral weight. If a promise lived only in clay, what did that say about the honor of the speaker? Anthropologists recognize this dynamic in many oral cultures. Memory is not merely a storage system, it is a social contract. Reciting a law publicly reinforces communal responsibility. A written record, by contrast, can appear cold, detached from human accountability. But the deeper reason was economic. Training rememberers was expensive but predictable. Writing, in its early unstable form, created new kinds of disputes. If 2 tablets disagreed, which was correct? If someone altered a mark, who could detect the fraud? Without standardized symbols and wide literacy, written records initially increased uncertainty rather than reducing it. For a fragile civilization already struggling with scale, that instability proved fatal. The councils tried to adopt it, Kareth explains, 3 times in 2 centuries. Each attempt ended the same way: conflicting tablets, contested readings, riots in the market courts. Eventually, the guilds and the palace reached a quiet consensus. The system was too dangerous to deploy prematurely. So the experiments were buried, sometimes literally. Fragments were destroyed, workshops dismantled, apprentices redirected into oral training. Over time, the official explanation hardened into legend. Writing had failed. Not because it was suppressed, but because it never worked. Generations passed. The memory guilds stabilized the city through elaborate recitation networks. The technology faded into rumor, until now. The apprentices absorbed this history in silence. Their discovery, which moments ago felt like a revolutionary secret, now feels more like the reopening of an ancient wound. Then why tell us? One apprentice asks. Kareth's expression darkens slightly. because this time, the city may not survive without it. Outside the kiln chamber, the urban system continues unraveling. Trade fragmentation has accelerated, grain seizures triggered black markets. Merchant coalitions now operate their own private witness guilds. The palace no longer controls information flow across the districts. In systems theory terms, the civilization is approaching a phase transition. When the cost of verification exceeds the benefit of cooperation, large-scale societies fragment into smaller trust networks. Writing, stable, standardized writing, could reverse that process by dramatically lowering information costs. But introducing it now carries enormous risk. If one faction gains exclusive control over written records, it could dominate every contract, law, and scientific observation moving forward. Knowledge accumulation would become asymmetric. Power would concentrate faster than the political system could adapt. It would be the second major climax of the story. Kareth rises slowly. "You believe writing will free knowledge," he says. "And perhaps it will, but understand the physics of what you are holding." He gestures toward the tablets. This is not merely a tool, it is a new layer of reality. In modern cognitive science, writing is often described as an extension of human memory, a form of external cognition. Once information can persist independently of biological brains, it begins to accumulate exponentially. Scientific progress accelerates. Legal systems become more complex. Economies expand. But that same persistence also makes power durable. A spoken lie fades when witnesses die. A written lie can last centuries. The apprentices now face a choice far larger than their original discovery. Do they release the system publicly and risk political chaos? Do they refine it secretly and attempt to introduce it gradually? Or do they bury it again, preserving the fragile equilibrium of a civilization built entirely on living memory? Kareth studies their faces carefully. The first inventors asked the same question, he says. They chose to wait. He pauses. This time, we may not have that luxury. Outside the chamber, somewhere in the city above, a distant alarm horn begins to echo through the streets. 3 long notes, the signal for a supply riot at the northern gates. And for the first time in centuries, the future of the civilization may depend on whether a handful of symbols scratched into clay can spread faster than fear.